Okay, thanks very much for joining me. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, and this is the first of a series of broadcasts that I'll be doing tonight and probably also tomorrow about the Mexican midterm elections in English to give us all on over the course of today and what to expect later on tonight as results come in. So, the big news for today, and there's been a lot of news, it's been a very active election day in Mexico in a lot of respects. The big news is the turnout. We don't have clear numbers on the turnout, but anecdotally, from what we've seen from representatives in precincts, and other reports from what we saw out and about today looking at precincts, turnout appears to be high. Now, this can go one of two ways, right? In general, the general rule of politics is that high turnout helps the left because the right has its core vote that always votes, and it's harder to get left votes who tend to be maybe lower income in more difficult situations to get out to vote, especially in the case of a midterm. So the general rule is that the left is benefited by a high turnout. Now, in the case of Mexico, we're looking at a midterm election where turnout is usually always lower. Mexican turnout usually for presidential elections is about 65%. For midterms, below 50%, 40. So usually it's lower. Plus the fact that there's always a vote of protest against the incumbent president, the incumbent party, which in this case is Morena and López Obrador. So who are these people that were out today? And that will be answered over the course of this evening. But what we can say now at 8 p.m. Central Time is there was a lot. We went to our precinct this morning, and by 8:30 there was a line around the corner. And this was the case in many others, especially in what's called the casillas especiales, which are special precincts set up to where people who are not in their home area can vote. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So high turnout, high enthusiasm seems to be the rule of the day. And of course, as I've been reporting in my Twitter over the course of several days, a series of fraudulent acts on the electoral front in the case of vote buying, particularly, in large part due to on the part of members of the right-wing coalition PRI, PAN, PRD, and this has been the case across the country, and especially in some red light states such as Guerrero, such as Oaxaca, such as Campeche, such as Sonora, etc. And we've seen cases of vote buying throughout the day. And in some cases, there's been violence in Metepec in the state of Mexico. A precinct was taken down, was destroyed, and then set back up, fortunately, and voting continued. The interesting thing about what happened in Metepec, which I think is exemplary of what happened in the elections today that we haven't seen in Mexican elections, and I've been, in one way or another, observing Mexican elections since 2006 at least, is the response by authorities. In the case of Metepec, where the precinct was broken up temporarily, the perpetrators ran away and were arrested. And were arrested. 15 of them were arrested and are right now facing charges. And this is a big, it's a sea change in Mexican politics, that electoral crimes, which have always happened, are now being prosecuted, at least to some extent, right? What we've seen in elections after elections would be that there'd be the buying of votes, most egregiously in 2012, when Peña Nieto effectively bought the presidential elections, distributing debit cards for the Soriana supermarket and the Monex Bank. But there have always been these practices of buying votes with building materials, buying votes with money, with cash. buying votes in a number of ways, and then the buyers of the votes would take your voter ID card so that you couldn't vote, so that they wouldn't allow you to vote, and that way they, be able to at least stop people from voting for the people they didn't want. And then there'd be all kinds of other ways to buy votes. For example, I was a poll worker in Ixtapalapa in 2018. People would very brazenly go in, take pictures on their cell phones of their votes, and go out and be paid for them, showing the picture of their vote. Or there are other things known as like the carousel, where somebody would give you a vote that was already marked, and you'd have to smuggle out a blank vote. And then that would be marked for a certain party, and then another person would smuggle that in and smuggle out another blank vote, et cetera. It's called the carousel. So these electoral crimes have been going on for a long time. And the game always was the Electoral Institute, the National Electoral Institute would say, oh, we can't do anything. Oh, we can't do anything. Call the FEPADE, which is the Special Prosecutor's Office for Electoral Crimes. And the FEPADE would never do anything, or they'd, open an investigation, and then a year later, maybe they'd come up with some, lame judgment once whoever had bought the election was already in power. And the INE would say, oh, we can't audit, we can't audit anybody's any candidate's campaign until after the election season's over and after the winner's already been declared. And this would just go on and on and on. And people would be very frustrated because people would take videos, and people would send in evidence, and people would call 1-800 numbers, and people would take down numbers and evidence and license plates and send all that evidence in, and nothing would ever happen. So the big difference this time around is that López Obrador, seeing this panorama of what could happen and what had already started to happen, sent out the National Guard. He sent out 100,000 members of the National Guard to different states to patrol around and get involved in stopping these things. A big difference in Mexico is that the AMLO administration and Congress passed a law in 2019 making electoral fraud a felony. Hard to believe, but that many different kinds of electoral fraud were not felonies in Mexico before this law was passed. And the idea was to send out the National Guard and to stop these crimes before they wound up influencing the results of the election. And that's what we saw in a number of cases. We saw it a couple of days ago in Sonora, where there was an attempted vote buying. Citizens put in the informed, and the National Guard stepped in. Now, I think there's a lot we can say about the National Guard, about a militarized police that is dangerous in the long term, to have a militarized police force. And there's something to be criticized about that. But when you see a case like the elections, where the National Electoral Institute never did anything, where the Special Prosecutor's Office, the FEPADE, never did anything, where the police not only never did anything, but were actually complicit in many cases with the people who were getting involved in electoral fraud, which are called mapaches in Mexico. You can see why there was a space for the National Guard to be out there, and we saw in a number of cases today of vote buying, and in the case of Metepec and in other instances, the National Guard making arrests. And this is a new thing, that the National Guard was making arrests with regards to electoral fraud, which was almost always virtually a case of impunity before now. So that's one difference today. Another difference, and I think this is a problem, well, it's definitely a problem, it's not just what I think, is the INE was very slow to set up precincts today, the National Electoral Institute. Somebody said on Twitter, which I think was very funny, the INE was so busy attacking Morena during the campaign season and trying to undermine Morena that they weren't doing their job. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. By 11:30, the Electoral Institute had only set up 72% of precincts across the country. By noon, 81%. That is, by noon on election day, an election day that ends at 6 o'clock. It's not one that goes very late into the day. By by noon, they'd only set up 81% of precincts. That means 1 in 5 precincts today in Mexico by noon were still not set up. And a lot of precincts take a little time to get off the ground. They're supposed to start at 8. A lot of them didn't really start till 9. That happens. These are citizens who are running the precincts. They're paid, 500 pesos for being there for the whole day. They get a very quick training. It's not their fault a lot of times. It's the fault of the high-paid people up above in the Electoral Institute who've been fucking around a lot the last few months instead of getting things ready, instead of getting things done. Now, finally, they said that 92% of precincts were installed and set up and working. But in places like Campeche and Oaxaca, that number was in the 80s. So where were all these other precincts? Did the poll workers not show up? Were the poll workers paid off to not show up, which we've seen in previous elections? Did they not work out the situation with poll workers? What was going on? And we need answers. We need answers from these things because, the Electoral Institute was very quick to, it removed 49 candidates from Morena at the beginning of the campaign season for supposedly not handing in their primary reports. So they're really sticklers for the rules when they want to be. But when it comes to their job of setting up precincts, they were very remiss. Where were they? Why did it take so long? Why at noon were there still 20% of precincts not accounted for? We need answers in these things. That's another important point from today. Along with the fact that when the National Guard was out, deployed to handle some of these electoral crimes, governors from non-Morena states were actively blocking the National Guard and actively trying to block the National Guard from doing its job in this case. And this is something I pointed out in Twitter early this morning. Morena may govern, has the control of the presidency in the federal Congress. But as of this point, and that will change by tomorrow, but as of this point, Morena only governs in 6 out of 32 states, and I think maybe 20% of municipalities, maybe 350 or so out of 2,000. So there's a lot of states where there were governors very hostile to Morena who were willing to, screw around, kind of stop the National Guard, old-fashioned methods of using state money, diverting state funds, to nefarious electoral purposes, either buying votes or illegal campaign acts and the other thing. I'm not trying to say that Morena is perfect in this. It isn't. But the most egregious cases that we saw today, you can check my Twitter feed, were states where governed by non-Morena governors, in states where there were governors' races that are fiercely contested. 15 governors' races are up today out of 32. Nearly half of the states are up for governors' races. A lot of municipalities, a lot of state legislatures. This is the biggest one-day electoral event in Mexican history. And so that's why you see in Campeche, where there was a governor's race, Campeche was a disaster zone today. There was vote buying. A Morena poll worker was allegedly dragged out of a precinct. There was all kinds of stuff going down in Campeche, and particularly in Ciudad del Carmen, where we've seen other videos of alleged vote buying activities in previous days. And in that case, the National Guard apparently wasn't, around or easy to find. So, we saw in Oaxaca cases today. We saw in a number of other states. So all of that brings us to where are we now? Where are we now? I don't want to extend this video too much because we don't have results yet. And I'll be back on later tonight with more results. But here are some preliminary results or tendencies that we can give, because there's all kinds of misleading exit polls out there. Of the 15 states that are up today for governor, it would appear very clear, and this is all very preliminary, so I'm not even going to share screens or anything right now, that Morena has won the states of Zacatecas, Guerrero, Tlaxcala, Michoacán, Colima, Campeche, Nayarit, and Sinaloa, as of right now. And it's interesting that two of those states, Michoacán and Guerrero, were states that the National Electoral Institute forced Morena to change their candidates with the hope of screwing them over there. And this apparently does not appear to have worked. And we'll see. States that are still close would be Chihuahua, Baja California Sur, and Nuevo León, all northern states where traditionally, any kind of even moderate center left has had less presence, and Morena has had less presence. I'm being told right here in the chat that Alfonso Durazo is being projected to win Sonora, so that would add another state to Morena's column, Sonora. And Morena could lose a couple of states, most likely. Querétaro, we don't know yet. This is all very early. But, and Morena looks set to hold the federal Congress. By what margin is the big question, and we'll see in a few hours. This is all still very preliminary. So, just to give a quick summary, high turnout today. Who will that benefit? Slow INE to set up the precincts. The National Guard was deployed. Governors tried to block the deployment of the National Guard. And Morena looks set to win in almost, very close to definitely in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 states, with 3 or 4 more up in the air. And it looks to be having a good night in the federal Congress. But all eyes must be on the Federal Electoral Institute, National Electoral Institute, because you never know what could happen over there. You never know what could happen over there, as we know very well from history. So I will be back a little bit later on. Let's set a date for maybe 10 o'clock, and we'll see where we're at. And we'll see where we're at again, and then I'll be on later again, and whatever we need to get these results out, and we can have some numbers later on this evening. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back a little bit later on.